You're going to be an influencer.
Nope. I'm going to influence people right out of this industry.
There's the cold open. We got it. Okay, so do we want to do our cold open like maintenance phase? Do we want to do like if books could kill style? How do you want to do this?
I think you already have your cold open.
I mean, I got a good one. I did come up with a Michael Hobbs-esque one. Ready?
Yeah.
Ready? I don't think you're ready for this. Welcome to the Other 51, where DEI stands for Dope Excellent Interviews.
I'm out.
Welcome to the Other 51. I'm your host, Brian Moritz, joined this week by Jen Moritz, my wife. We'll just get that out of the way because the last names probably give it away. Also, and I hope I get this title right, senior editor and inclusive language specialist.
Yeah, I wanted you to work for it. Also, I could be your sister based on how this podcast goes. So I think you did need the clarification.
We did need the clarification, although my sister has been on numerous times. Okay. But also, most importantly, among all of that stuff, Jen Moritz, the reason why I stare at a 6-foot-tall cutout of Baz from the Carry On series every working day of my life. Welcome to the show, buddy.
Thanks. Nobody knows who Baz is, so we might have to explain that.
I'll let you field that one.
Not right now, but yeah. Or just Google it. You know, he's pretty amazing.
He is something, and we'll get to all this stuff later in the show, I assume. But what I want to talk about, and what I want to have you on the show for a long time now, is that last part of your job title, which is relatively new. Congratulations, by the way. It's pretty awesome. So, inclusive language specialist. So, let's start right at the very beginning, I guess, with what is inclusive language?
So it's exactly what it sounds like. Inclusive language is making sure that the words you use are, accessible and, I hate to define a word with the word, and inclusive for everybody, that everybody who is receiving your message. And, that changes depending on your message, your audience. Inclusive doesn't necessarily mean everybody in the world is included in your message. It means everybody in your audience is included in your message. So you're using words that aren't going to cause any harm. They are going to be relatable to people. They are going to be accurate. And I don't just mean by definition, I mean accurate for the community you're speaking to. So it's kind of hard to define in a way because it is so far reaching. But for me, at the end of the day, it's using language that is not going to cause any harm at any level for the people you're talking to.
How'd you get interested in this?
So it's kind of it's a slow build, right, over many, many years. And so in many ways, it was a very slow build, right, as my own beliefs and the way I use my own language have evolved and changed over time. But on a shorter, time frame, I work in advertising and marketing, and our industry has changed a whole lot. We focus really heavily now on numbers and metrics, and a lot of stuff is automated. And as a word person, I don't always love that. And so I was looking for a way to bring some, more of the human aspect back into my job. And so a few years ago, probably around the start of the pandemic, I started dipping into inclusive language and taking my job as an editor beyond just proofreading and grammar and even rewriting, which I really love, into the inclusive language space. And then the more I did that, the more I loved it, the more I saw its impact on our work and on other people I work with. And so a year or so ago, I went to my supervisor and I said, I love this. I need to hold on to it really tight and I need to own it. And they're wonderful. And we're like, yep, we're going to let you own that. It's a great thing for us. It's a great thing for you. And so now I'm officially inclusive language specialist, which just feels really good and is really fun.
I want to circle back eventually to the inclusive language as like the next step of editing, because I think that's super interesting and I think a really important part of this. But for your own work in this, and lately I feel like I've been asking the similar question of a lot of people a lot, and something I'm kind of obsessed with, of the moments, right? So was there a moment that you can remember when you said you started dipping your toe in inclusive language stuff around, the beginning of the pandemic or whenever? Do you remember a specific moment where it was like, ooh, this is where I want to go, or this is what I'm super interested in?
I don't think it was a moment. I think it was sort of a time frame, right? Because all of this happened during the pandemic. I mean, kind of like formally happened during the pandemic. And then, of course, there was, Black Lives Matter, and that whole movement was happening. And we live near Rochester, so it was happening a lot here. And the work we were doing was talking to a lot of that stuff. And so it was really right in front of me. And everything from, we had a president at the time who was using slang and offensive terms for COVID-19 instead of just calling it COVID-19, all the way to we have very specific clients writing very specific things about race and things going on in our community. So, like, it wasn't one moment, but it was, but it was a time full of little moments. But what I will say is more recently, I guess I can tell this story. I don't think I'm crossing any lines, but a moment that really sparked me and made me really excited is we had designed something at work, and it related to historical figures in our community. And I don't want to give too many details because I don't think that's my place here. But we had designed something that was really great and really beautiful, and I thought is the kind of thing that I would pick up off the shelves. And then somebody questioned whether some of the phrases we had used on it were appropriate. And so I started looking into these historical figures more closely and learning things about their backgrounds and who they were as people, because they are long since dead. And I learned things about them that if they saw the design we had created and the words we had used, they would have been very hurt by that. And their legacies would probably be very hurt by that. And people in our communities today seeing that also would have been hurt by that. But it was this great moment where I was able to, with the help of some colleagues who actually threw some flags here, I was able to not only stop something harmful, but help preserve someone's legacy without damaging it. And, in this tiny little itty bitty way. And I learned something. I got a great history lesson that then I could take back and share with 100 people and say, look what I learned. This is really cool. And I didn't know that. Now we all know that. And so those kind of moments are the ones that are going to pull through this kind of work. I think we think of it as a very sometimes dry thing, and you think of it as a very buttoned up, proper thing where you're constantly worried about feelings. But I wasn't going to hurt the feelings of somebody who died hundreds of years ago or 100 years ago. But it was exciting to do that work and learn something because I love to learn. And so those are the things that are going to make it stick.
So if we can give some, I was wondering if we can talk a little more specifically on some examples of using inclusive language. And you don't have to talk specific clients or specific stuff like that example you just used, but kind of moving this from this general idea of inclusive language, which sounds very cool or very woo-woo, depending on how you're coming to this conversation. So what are some of the things when you're editing for inclusive language or thinking of inclusive languages? I know it's just part of it. What are you looking for here? What's that look like kind of more granularly and specifically?
Yeah. So it's easy to think of it as woo woo, like you said, but I think it helps to think about everybody. I think we think of the people who are paying attention as one type of person or political thought or social belief, and that's not true because it does apply to the full spectrum. And so what I'm looking for are the words that may give me pause if I'm in someone else's shoes. And I know that's a very generic way of saying that probably doesn't feel very helpful. But, we've talked, the two of us, and on this podcast actually before, about the grammar tingle. It's like the spidey sense. And it's just an extension of that. Mm-hmm. Is there a word that feels a little out of place? Is there a word that something scratches at the back of my head? Is there something that maybe our kid would raise an eyebrow at, or our neighbor, or the person who actually I completely disagree with? Would they pause at that word? Those are the words. You don't have to know if every word is inclusive or not inclusive. And you actually don't have to fix every word that is inclusive or not inclusive. The trick is to know when to just pause and Google it, right. And make that consideration. So I don't know that there is a specific thing you're looking for. It's just sort of a feeling, and you have to trust the feeling that you have to just pause for a minute and look it up. And what I will say is every time somebody else reviews work and points something out that I didn't flag, I learn from that.
Okay.
And they're more often than not, people will flag things that to me seemed fine, and maybe they are fine at the end of the day. Often they are fine at the end of the day, but it's always good to have somebody else say, but could we stop for a second and look at that word right there?
Right.
And see what we think about that.
Right. And we've talked about this offline and probably on this podcast too, but that pause is the point of it, right? Like, it's not necessarily about changing or, confrontation or whatever. It's just that taking that second to, hey, is this okay?
Right.
Sometimes it is. A lot of times it is. But that pause is the point.
And you don't know what you don't know.
Right.
So, there are going to be, a lot of the words are not going to raise flags for you. So let somebody else raise those flags and trust them that they are raising them for a reason, and then learn from it. And other ones, I don't know if this one specific word in front of me is a problem, but I'm going to look it up, because then I will learn from it.
And I think what's interesting too in seeing you do this work and talking with it is how when you say inclusive, when we talk about inclusive language, like, that is a wide net. We joked about maintenance phase earlier in this episode, but I think the work that Michael and Aubrey have done talking about health and wellness and fat phobia and all of that have really kind of, like, that's a level I think that a lot of people don't instinctively think about when they think about inclusive language, right? Usually thinking about race, usually thinking about sexual orientation, gender identity, all those things. But, from your experience too, color blindness, like, all of these things are under this umbrella.
Yeah, you don't think of something physical as inclusive language. Right. But I mean, to be really, nitpicky about it, I am colorblind. And if there is language written on something and I can't see it, well, that's a problem. Is that inclusive language? Not really, but it is inclusive. And to me, as someone who is colorblind and, feels it daily, but doesn't really make a big deal out of it, it doesn't really affect my life that much, other than that I wear a lot of black and can't tell you what color things are. But it doesn't hinder my life day to day. But I'm still trying to normalize that in the work I do. Normalize saying, I can't see this. Somebody can't see this. And it's interesting because when I started my current job 12 years ago, I hid it from them that I was colorblind, because it was a creative agency and I didn't want it to hurt my prospects getting the job or doing the job. I didn't want people to be like, well, she's colorblind, she can't see that. Now, because we've all grown so much in this area, now I'm using it as my strength. And I'm saying, I'm colorblind, and I'm not on the grand spectrum of being colorblind. I'm not that colorblind. So if I'm struggling with it, 10 people who see this are going to struggle with it more. But I want to back up for a second to what you said about Mike and Aubrey and maintenance phase, because they've actually, I think, an important takeaway from that. And so they talk about wellness and weight, and they're very fat positive. And I had someone once ask me at a presentation if I had any advice for them on how to talk about people's weight in a medical setting. And I said, I don't. That's not my area of expertise at the moment, but it's one I'm very interested in, and I have since then gotten better at. But what I said to them was, if you have favorites who are talking about this, who make it feel good to you when they talk about it, and I used maintenance phase as an example, and this person loved them, so they were already familiar with them. I said, well, great. If you love the way, let's say, Aubrey Gordon talks about weight, then borrow her words. Right. Use the words that feel good that she's using, because they resonated with you. So, somebody else's language is not going to be perfect for you, but it is a place to start. And so I thought that felt really... that was really great. It was really empowering.
So when your spidey sense goes off, your grammar tingle, as we have called it in the past, but for inclusive language, and just maybe specifically in those instances, but also in general, like when you were starting to get involved in learning about this, what are the resources you used? How do you kind of find what are the resources you use? How did you start learning and teaching yourself about this kind of thing?
I mean, it's a little embarrassing in its simplicity that I start by Googling the phrase and the word offensive or harmful or problematic, right? If you will find amazing threads out there. And I'm not saying something like Reddit is the expert, but real people are on Reddit telling you their real feelings. And so if somebody has a problem with it, well, somebody else is going to have a problem with it too. So that's a great place to start, is just Google the phrase that you're curious about and throw some words in there like problematic or offensive or harmful. You'll get a million hits and they will all be fascinating. And a lot of them will be people saying, you're being too sensitive. There's nothing wrong with this. They won't be saying it that nicely, but they will be saying that. And you start from there. So I also follow, I get newsletters from a thing called the Conscious Language Newsletter, which I find really helpful. It's sort of an aggregate of recent writings about inclusive language and then some of their own stuff. And, just start finding your expert. Rabbit with a Red Pen was really useful to me early on. She's a sensitivity reader, which I am calling her that, but she has since changed the way she talks about her own work. And I believe she now calls herself an authenticity reader.
Interesting.
And so her job is to look at writing and make sure that it is authentic to the audience or to the community it's representing. So, you're Polish, right? I'm Ukrainian. If somebody is writing a story about being Polish or Ukrainian, an authenticity reader would read that and make sure that the Polish words or the Ukrainian words they're using are accurate, that the references they're making are true, or at least not completely out of the realm of possibility. I would recommend you look her up. She has great, very specific examples that I'm not doing justice to.
So the Polish Ukrainian thing is I think it's a cool little side note, because I think it's an interesting potential way in for anybody who might be resistant to inclusive language. And by that, I mean, like, using our example, like if you say something is Polish but it's Ukrainian, most people be like, close enough, or whatever. But to someone who's Ukrainian or someone who's Polish, that matters, and that matters a lot. We've had things like that happen in our family on both sides of it, right? And so I think that's an interesting way to, okay, this is how it matters to you. Now matters to other communities the same way.
Yeah, that's a good point. I think that's probably a good way to start getting comfortable in this kind of work, is find the thing that matters to you. It doesn't matter what it is. For me, it could be theater. Find somebody writing about theater and look at it through a critical lens as a fan. I mean, how often do, they turn books into movies and you go see the movie and you're like, well, that's not true. That's not what happened in the book. Mm-hmm. It's sort of the same mentality.
Yeah.
This is a thing that matters a lot to you. And somebody who's not you is writing or talking or telling or showing it. And they may not be doing it justice. And the examples we're using are not, they're not critical,
right.
But then once you push that forward into the more meaningful areas, it becomes more critical.
But and in one way, like, it's not meaningful, but it is meaningful to the people in that community or involved. Right. And so I think that's a door opener, right?
And thank you for calling that out, because as the word came out of my mouth, I was like, I don't think that was the right thing to say. But which is another good point. When you mess up, just own it.
Yeah.
Occasionally I will give presentations to community groups to talk about inclusive language and how they can start using it. And then at the end, I like to take a minute and be like, so listen, I know I said this thing. I don't feel good about it. And I just want to acknowledge it and tell you that I'm sorry if that harmed anybody in the room. I'm learning too. You will always be learning. You will never have perfect language and perfect representation. You're just doing your best. But when you own it and you acknowledge it, I mean, that goes so far with everybody.
So I think one example that kind of ties together a lot of the threads that we've been talking about in this conversation right now is the phrase rule of thumb. All right, so tell me the story of the phrase rule of thumb.
Okay, so I did a little homework so I can tell you a real story here instead of me flying by the seat of my pants, and we'll look that phrase up later to see if there's anything harmful in there. I'm sorry. Okay, so the way the story goes, and nobody get too attached to this, I want to say that right up front. So there is let's call it a folk etymology around rule of thumb that says that husbands back in like the 1700s could beat their wives with a stick as long as it was no thicker than his thumb. And so we have that phrase will often pop up on do not use lists of common phrases that actually have sort of more sinister origins.
Sure.
And so I had it on a list like that for a couple of years. And then somebody I follow on Instagram, tell me if I get his name wrong. I think it's Abraham Piper.
Yep.
Is that it?
Yeah.
He's wonderful and absolutely worth a follow. He did a little thing about how rule of thumb doesn't really mean that. And so I'm like, oh, talk to me. This is fascinating. So here are the notes I took on it because I think this is great. So there is no record of anybody ever saying that you could beat your wife with a stick smaller than a man's thumb.
Okay.
There were rules that say you could, that said husbands could use moderate correction against their wives. And these are old English, British rules. But the word thumb has never appeared in any of them. So I did find some really cool origins of the phrase. Nobody actually knows where it came from. We know that it has nothing to do with beating your wife. There's a miller's thumb. And during medieval times, the people who ground flour would rub it between their thumb and their finger to see if they had to continue grinding it to get it to the fineness they wanted. There's a brewer's thumb, where they sometimes will dip their thumb into the vat to test the temperature. There's a seafaring thumb, where captains or whoever was guiding the ship would use their thumb to measure a safe distance away from things like rocks on a map. And then, back in like the 1600s, goods were often measured by the length of a thumb. So it was just like a way to get a standardized measurement that it was about 1 inch if you measure from your first joint to the tip of your thumb. But my favorite argument, and I can't pronounce any of these words because I don't know French or Italian, is that the word for thumb in French is Pouce.
Pouce?
Sure. And the word for inch in French is also Pouce. The Italian word for thumb is Pollice, and that is also the same word for inch. And in Spanish, this is the one I can pronounce, the word thumb is pulgar, and the word for inch is pulgada. So rule of thumb is probably just a language, root, a root word thing, where the words for thumb and the words for inch happen to be the same.
And kind of like a basis of measurement or like a sort of...
Yeah, so the rule of thumb is that thumbs are measured basically by like an inch, and sometimes, we didn't always have rulers. That's really probably where it comes from.
Right. Side note, really quick, just I remember, I think this was on This American Life or Radiolab, like when you read old books about medicine and treating sick and they say 3 Our Fathers or 3 Hail Marys, like the idea isn't that they were necessarily calling divine intervention. It's like they didn't have clocks, so you knew how long it took to say that, and so that was like how long you rested or something like that. But so the double twist on rule of thumb is there are many people, many writers who believe, and probably believe very strongly, that rule of thumb has its roots in beating women, and so you should not use it because it's problematic. So how do you, as an inclusive language specialist, as an editor, how do you kind of okay, it's not offensive, but people really think it is. So how do you deal with that?
So that's where inclusive language work comes in. Is rule of thumb offensive? No. Does it have an offensive origin? No. But do plenty of people believe it does? Yeah. And are you going to reach everybody with this message that rule of thumb is not about beating a woman with a stick smaller than a thumb? No, right? We don't have any way of reaching everybody in the world to say this relatively insignificant etymology is not true, right? That's just not something that's going to happen. So what is the alternative then? You can use the phrase knowing that you may be harming word nerds or, history nerds who believe this, or you can just steer clear of it because writing rule of thumb is probably not going to make or break the quality of your writing or the way people read your story. So, like anything in life, sometimes you just err on the side of caution because caution is kindness. And, which is to say, if the phrase rule of thumb slips into your writing, how much harm are you going to do to someone who reads that? Probably very much, or not very much. But we're not using rule of thumb as the be-all, end-all example, right? We're using rule of thumb as an example for other phrases that you could be using.
Right.
So when in doubt, choose not to harm somebody.
That's kind of the core rule of all this, right?
Of course.
Yeah, I love that caution is kindness, and it's such a great way I think of looking at it, because I think for some writers, and maybe all writers all the time, but like some writers, you can very much see I can't say anything anymore and blah 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 blah. And I know, and we know that's not true, but sometimes people will make that argument. But like reframing it as no, writing from a place of kindness is really powerful, I think.
Well, it is. And if your writing hinges on a phrase that is inflammatory, or even if it's not, right? If you've written a book and your editor comes back to you and says, we'd like you to not use the phrase rule of thumb on page 422, and you think that's going to unravel your writing, then I have some really bad news for you about your writing. And maybe think of it as a challenge and a game, right, and a challenge to make your writing better.
Right. Nobody likes well actually guy, but really nobody likes double well actually guy. So kind of staring back to the in inclusive language as editing, like how much this feels like such, I want to say third or fourth level editing, but looking at your career as an editor, but editing in general, where we are in 2024 and beyond, like this just, I don't really have a well-formed question here, but this just feels like such an important level of editing beyond what we think of editing, right? Beyond like obviously proofreading and typos and all of that, but also like just general flow and stuff. But this is like that other level of editing. It seems like an exciting area of editing to like think about and go forward in.
It is, and I'd love to think of it as the future of editing. So, we've been talking about this here and we've been talking about it at work, and I hate to say it because everybody's going to groan, but with AI being what it is now, it is smart as a proofreader or an editor to be looking at what's coming from that direction. And, anybody can run spell check and anybody can auto-generate copy, but there's always a human element that is needed. And for me, that human element is things like clarity and your flow of your copy, but it also is speaking to the correct audience and being inclusive with your language and making sure things are accurate and true. And, I think, I hope that this is the future of editing. I hope that we as a society start weaving humanity back into our very digital world and our very auto-generated world. And I think this is how we do it, at least in this industry. And I don't know, I was just saying to my boss at work that I think we are primed to bring humanity back into this kind of work. And I don't know, I just think everything is so mean out there right now. And I think a lot of people are just feeling that they don't want that anymore. And if I can tell you that pausing for 10 minutes and making sure that the work you're doing is going to make everybody feel good, then wouldn't you want to do that in this sea of everything else that's going on?
Oh, that's so good.
It sounds so like, I don't know.
No, it's so good. I was over here sitting here thinking about just for individual editors, like finding that thing, beyond that AI can't do, and I was thinking about it more in terms of career advice and things you could do, but then you take it to this other level and it's so good and it's so real, right?
Yeah, well, I mean, look, like I said, anybody can be trained to find typos and misspellings and commas and that kind of stuff. But if you want to be an editor, if you are an editor, you are probably doing it because your real goal is to make writing better. Mm-hmm. And yes, commas and spelling and punctuation and even basic grammar are all ways to make writing better, but so are things like inclusive language. And it's just the next thing, I think. And I would be shocked if in 10 years we're not talking about this in job descriptions.
Right. All right, I'm buckling in for this one because, it's the question I end with.
I don't have an answer.
Oh, come on. Okay, so the question is the best thing you've read lately.
Okay.
And you've read like 4,000 books already in 2024.
I don't know how many. It's like 30. Oh. Okay, so I'm going to give you two answers, and one of them is going to be non-committal, and I'm really sorry about that. Okay, so one is braggy. I want to say here that doing this banned books project So I'm going to put all of those books on the list. I've read, I think, 13 banned books in 13 months because they're under attack, obviously, in our schools. And I think it's important to understand what is being challenged, and also I'm buying them so that down the road we can donate them to our local schools and get them in kids' hands. So I will tell you, those are some of the best reads I've had. They've also been some of the worst reads I've had in the past year, I'll be honest. But when they're good, they're just wonderful. I would highly recommend Flamer by Henry Holt, because I am looking at it. That one was excellent. I feel like I'm going to come up short, so I'm not going to mention any others. Oh, you know what? I also loved Other Words from Home. I can't tell you the person's first name, but their last name is Warga. Okay, so anyway, that's the self-gratifying answer. The real wishy-washy answer for you is I'm reading a ton of fantasy these days, which is relatively new to me, but we are all deep in the Mossverse around here. And also the Empyrean series by Rebecca Yarros, because I am a basic girl reading all the TikTok books. So I'm currently I'm on the last book of the Throne of Glass series, and that's a lot of pages, and I am eagerly waiting for the next Fourth Wing Iron Flame. Is it Onyx? I can't remember the name.
Something dragon smut.
I'm going to put anything with dragons and wings in my best thing I have read lately list.
So I was going to say, this is where we talk about the 2,500 pages of fairy smut that you convinced me to read over the past few months.
Not fairy smut, and
there is fairy smut in those books.
Yeah, it's like 3% of the entire 400,000 pages of Sarah J. Maas that I have asked you to read, and you have lovingly done so.
I actually have lovingly done so. So I read the first three, the main books in ACOTAR, the first three. I didn't read the fourth because I was told I didn't need to read the fourth.
I'm a good wife, but a bad reader.
But no, they are, and I read both of the Fourth Wing books, and they are entertaining as hell. I will admit, they are super fun.
I'm going to go in on the Fourth Wing on the Empyrean books, because here's the thing. I've now read, and I have not done a count on Sarah J. Maas. It really is like tens of thousands of pages. And they're wonderfully written. They're beautiful. She's an incredible storyteller, and I do not have the attention span for that many pages. It's not her fault. Like I said, I'm still on the last book of Throne of Glass, and it's just taking me a long time because I needed to reset. And then let's all remember that I read for my job.
Right.
So I read 40 hours a week, and then I turn around and I read for fun. But what I love about the Empyrean series, Rebecca Yarros, is that they are so much more digestible for me. And when I'm coming off of, a busy week at work, I don't need 100,000 pages. I need 500 pages, and it moves along so quick, and it's just the sweet spot for me. I love them very much.
They are very good. I'll have links to just the general pages. If I put links to every single book, I'm already doing that for the banned books, so the show notes are gonna be like 12 pages
Everybody
long.
needs links to the two most popular series of the past 5 years. You definitely could not find them on your own.
She added to me even when we're recording a podcast, guys. Love this journey for me. All right, Jen Moritz, this has been amazing. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Thanks for listening to The Other 51. Special thanks to Jen Moritz for being our guest this weekend, for being a pretty awesome human being. Jen also does our graphic design for all of our episodes and our Instagram page, and our daughter Ellie Moritz did our theme music. I'm Brian, and I'll talk to you next time.